Welcome to this Fall Luncheon and Trending Topics presentation. As I believe all League members, I know we have both League members and non-members here. As you know, the League has organized a campaign, Unite and Rise, that is focused on reaching 8.5 million people. In the words of our President Selena Stewart, our democracy is strongest when we lead together and reach communities beyond the voting rights ecosystem. Those of us who are in the inside, or you might, as they said in Casablanca, the usual suspects. The League has been working on democracy since 1920, and of course the founders were working to improve our democracy before that in order to get women the right to vote. Throughout its 100-plus years history, the League has maintained a stance of nonpartisanship. We annoy both parties from time to time. So we do not endorse or oppose any candidate. We do support policies. And when I've been in Annapolis, sometimes a Democrat will accuse me of working with the Republicans, and sometimes a Republican will accuse me of working with the Democrats. Too bad. We advocate for policies, and we particularly focus on ensuring that the process of democracy itself is fair and open. So we are delighted to have today as our speaker Ellen Weintraub. Ms. Weintraub served as the commissioner and four-time chair of the United States Federal Election Commission from 2002 to 2025. She has been an outspoken advocate for meaningful campaign finance law enforcement, robust disclosure, combating foreign influence in our elections, and protecting the institutions of our democracy. And you notice I had said she served until 2025. On February 6, 2025, contrary to law and precedent, she was fired by the president without cause and without a replacement. So if anybody's looking for that job, resulting in the Federal Election Commission losing its functional quorum in May 2025. This is very concerning when you disable an important government commission by just not filling seats. Ellen Weintraub is a graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School. She has published articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and leading law reviews, and is a frequent speaker on news shows and at conferences at home and abroad. Previously, she practiced law with the political law group at Perkins, is it Coie, LLP, and was counsel to the U.S. House of Representatives Ethics Committee. And she is currently a senior fellow at End Citizens United. Please give a warm welcome to Ellen Weintraub.
All right, the first thing I always have to do is lower the mic. Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction, for this warm welcome. It's really an honor for me to speak to all of you here today. I did not choose the title for this speech, which is a little bit ambitious. So for those of you who came here thinking, oh, Ellen's going to tell us how to fix democracy, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I hope to engage you in a conversation where we can work together toward that ambitious goal. I've been listening to a podcast about the history of this country, focusing most recently on, in the episodes I've been listening to, on the Civil War era. And like I think some of you in this room, I am old enough to remember the 1960s. I was a very small child, but I have a good memory, where times were very contentious. citizens were clashing, there was violence in the streets, and it's important to remind ourselves that, you know, we have gotten through as a nation tough times before, and we can get through tough times again and emerge on the other side. And we can do that by working together and making sure that we get through on the other side. It's not going to happen by itself. Not that there aren't serious causes for concern these days. I always find it awkward when I have to criticize somebody in the other party. I am a Democrat. I was appointed to a Democratic seat on the Federal Election Commission, so there's no secret about that. That's part of my public persona. I wish that the issues of democracy were not partisan, but in many respects they have become partisan, and that is because of where the parties have lined up. And I find that a very unfortunate development, and again, I hope that that will not persist over time. But, you know, we are living in a time now where the president is issuing increasingly unhinged rants, demanding that his political adversaries be prosecuted. He's going after those he sees as his political opponents, the organizations that fund them, and anyone who challenges his preferred narrative. At a time when civil society has never been more vital, he's going after law firms, academics, and foundations. And he's attacking the very mechanisms of government accountability, firing inspectors general, I always get that wrong, prosecutors who refuse to bring prosecutions that are unsupported by the evidence, government ethics officials, the special counsel charged with administering the Hatch Act, the law that's supposed to keep the government out of partisan politics. Career civil servants whose loyalty is to the Constitution and not the temporary current resident of the White House. And we are learning how many ways there are for a determined and unbound president to undermine government agencies whose missions he finds inconvenient. He has zeroed out budgets. He has fired staff. In the case of the Federal Election Commission, where I served, which is supposed to be regulating the billions of dollars that will be spent in the next election. In the last 3 cycles, there's been $9 to $9.5 billion spent in the midterms, more in the presidential years, but, you know, we're coming up on a midterm, and I see no reason to think people are going to spend less money this time around. And, you know, we need a cop on the beat, and we don't have one. In the case of the Federal Election Commission, it's death by decapitation. So he didn't have to zero out the budget or fire all the staff. He just needed to get rid of the commissioners, without whom the agency cannot make policy decisions. It can't enforce the law. He fired me. And one by one, all of the Republican commissioners resigned, leaving the agency without a working quorum of leaders, paralyzing the agency in most of its key functions. An agency that is empowered to ensure that political committees, including the president's political committees, are following the law. It's an unusual agency that actually regulates politicians. And so it is not actually surprising that the president thinks it's just fine to have it basically out of business. All of this is bad for democracy and government and the public interest, but in the small town that Washington really is, it's also personal. The president fired me. He fired my friends. He fired some of you and some of your friends. I'm betting that every person in this room knows someone, is connected to someone, perhaps loves someone who has been affected and perhaps lost their job because of these decisions. And these attacks on the dedicated public servants who just went to work every day to try and improve the lives of their fellow citizens, often forgoing more lucrative opportunities in the private sector. And I contrast that sense of dedication and public spiritedness and sacrifice with the unprecedented monetization of the White House by the current resident. A plane from Qatar, millions invested in the family's new crypto business, which didn't exist until he was president, likely including a lot of foreign money. The president has filed a claim against his own government, asking for $230 million, taxpayer dollars, money that you and I pay on in our taxes. He wants that money to put in his own pocket. When have we ever seen a president of the United States who asked the government to pay him, beyond salary, of course, to pay him taxpayer funds? And this is at a time when he's balking at paying SNAP benefits to vulnerable and hungry citizens, and health care premiums for non-billionaire Americans are about to skyrocket. New Yorker writer David Kirkpatrick ran the numbers and estimated that as of August, so the numbers have probably gone up since then, the Trump family has profited from the presidency to the tune of $3.4 billion. It's astonishing. And to use an overused word, certainly unprecedented. In what, so in the midst of all this, maybe some of you are taking some comfort from this week's election results. I thought this really could change the tenor of what I had to say after the election results. I know I am somewhat comforted by them. Because I think there is a lot that deserves opposition on policy grounds, not on partisan grounds, but on policy grounds. There are things that are happening that are bad for our democracy, and it is good for American citizens to voice their concerns about that and their opposition to that. So I'm happy about the election results this week. I admit to having somewhat mixed feelings about what's going on in redistricting. I support what California did, because you can't fight with one arm tied behind your back, and if one side is going to be very aggressive about partisan gerrymandering, the other side really has to respond. But I think we really do need a national law on redistricting to get rid of partisan redistricting and mid-decade redistricting and this business of changing the districts every time you think you can get an extra seat out of it. It is unfortunately not something that seems to work if you do it on a state-by-state basis. There were, I think a lot of advocates were working on that for a long time, and I respect and support that work. And, one state after another, I think we were up to something like 24 states, something in the 20s, that had adopted neutral, independent redistricting commissions. But the problem is you can't do it state by state. That's the lesson of this year. You got to have it done across the country. And then I think that will be so much better for governance, because what we're going to end up with after all of these aggressive redistrictings on both sides is the real election will be the primary. Only the most active and extreme people in the party turn out for the primary. I don't understand that. I love to vote. I vote in every single election. I bet all of you vote in every election, including the primaries. But a lot of people don't. So you only get the most extreme folks voting and the most extreme folks nominated, and then if it's basically a one-party district, that's who you're going to send to Congress, a whole bunch of people who are very far apart and cannot work together. So I think this is, an issue for the future. It's not something we can address right now, but it's something that has to be addressed on a national basis. But I have to say, I remain, despite the positive trends from this week's election, I remain very concerned about the 2026 and the 2028 elections. In what appears to be yet another attempt to concoct support for unproven claims of voter fraud, the Department of Justice has issued exhaustive voting records requests to multiple states. Voting rights lawsuits have been dismissed, and of course the Supreme Court's not helping, since it keeps knocking the pins out of the Voting Rights Act, and I'm really worried about what's going to happen with the latest case before the Supreme Court. Divisions of the Justice Department targeting foreign interference in our elections have been dismembered. Attempts are underway to make voter registration and the voting process more onerous by, for example, discouraging early voting and voting by mail. The League of Women Voters has long been a champion of making voting more accessible, and we all have to keep fighting for that. The president does not have control over the election process. The Constitution gives that to the states. I'm sure you all know that. He really does not, he cannot, although he tried, by executive order, ban voting by mail, but he can exert influence over some state legislatures and some states and some governors to try and make it harder and harder for people to vote. And then if there are if strange things happen on Election Day, if you restrict voting by mail, if you restrict early voting so that it all comes down to who shows up on Election Day, and then you make it harder for people to get to the polls one way or another on Election Day, you know, at the end of the day, whoever doesn't make it to the polls, doesn't get their vote counted, there's no way to fix that. You can't come back after the election and say, but I wanted to vote, but I was prevented. My vote was suppressed. Well, we don't have a remedy for that in our country. It's just sort of too bad they only count the votes that were actually cast. And I hope that they will count all the votes, because I do worry about interference with that. In part because of harassment stemming from widespread conspiracy theories about voter fraud. There's been a lot of turnover in the ranks of election workers. The typical election worker is, like many of us in the room, a woman over the age of 50. So, you know, these people in small towns across the country who are just trying to do their public-spirited duty to their community, and they get harassing phone calls and they get threats. You know, they say, hey, I'm out. I didn't sign up for this. So I think we are one risk to this, to the upcoming elections. We're going to have a lot of inexperienced people running the elections because there's a lot of turnover. Some of them will be conspiracy theorists and election deniers who went out and sought those roles particularly to advance those conspiracies. But some of them were just going to be inexperienced people who are doing it for the first time and learning the ropes, and mistakes could happen. And if innocent mistakes happen, whether they actually affect the outcome or not, that again will become more fodder for the conspiracy theories, which will become, I fear, catastrophized into new conspiracy theories to undermine trust in our elections, which have been really taking a beating. Trust in our election systems have really been taking a beating. I can recall when I first, in the early days of my tenure at the FEC, one of the things I used to do a lot was talk to international visitors that the State Department would bring around to different agencies to learn about our democracy. And I remember someone asking me years ago, why do people accept the election results? In my country, you know, if your party lost, they would assume the fix was in and people wouldn't accept it. And I had to admit, it had never crossed my mind at that point that people in America would not accept the election results. So that's, you know, look at where we are now in terms of trust in our elections and people having faith in their fellow citizens who are, as I said, just doing their civic duty, trying to help run the elections. Most alarmingly, I worry about the president seeking to deploy the military to U.S. cities during the next election. As I'm sure you know, the Constitution says he can't do that, and the military is not allowed to be in polling places under the law. But one could well imagine this administration developing pretexts for troop deployments in Democratic strongholds in an effort to suppress voting. There was a good decision just last night, from a Trump-appointed judge out in Oregon, barring the president from deploying the National Guard in Oregon. So that was good. It will be appealed, but hopefully it will be upheld. We cannot allow the use of the military on American soil against American citizens to become normalized. We just cannot accept this. So what can we do? Well, let's start by being kind to ourselves. These are hard times, and a lot of people are suffering in one way or another. I would urge you to make sure that you are all taking care of yourselves and your families and your friends and your community. We're in this fight for the long haul, and we have to keep up our strength, listen to beautiful music. We're in this beautiful setting. I hope you'll all get out and enjoy this beautiful day. Take a walk in nature. Try and feed your soul. We need to do that for ourselves. And then we need to work together. We also need to stay together and work together. Collective action is really important because the president's trying to pick off people and organizations one by one, and he can't fight everybody all at once, all at the same time, if we all pull together. So stay informed, show up, be peaceful. On October 18th, 7 million Americans showed up, and it mattered. It mattered. Bear witness. And organizations like the League, who are in the forefront of this fight, can magnify their influence by working together with other partners. There are a lot of good organizations out there. I know the League is working with a number of other organizations. Find out who the League is working with, volunteer for a committee, see if you can help forge greater connections, because that collective action is really very important. I don't know who's organizing these No King's Day rallies. I think we need more of them, personally. Getting out on the streets every 6 months, that's not enough. We need to be out there all the time to show how we feel about what's going on. And then there are obviously things we can do around the election. It's going to be, we just had an election, but there's another election coming up before we know it. Obviously, I bet everybody in this room votes. We all need to vote. We need to encourage everybody in our networks to vote, particularly if you have friends or family in swing states or districts. It is both a blessing and a frustration to be living in Montgomery County, a place where I really don't worry about the election administration. And yes, well done. Thank you, David. We appreciate you. And at the state level as well, we have very good election administrators. We, in a lot of other places, I would be advocating, writing to your congressmen and your senators to urge them to vote for laws that will improve our democracy. We're pretty well represented here in Montgomery County. I don't think Jamie Raskin needs me to tell him to fight for democracy. He's out there swinging, and we're lucky to have him. But if you have people in your network who are in other places with other representatives who are perhaps less committed to the fight, I would encourage you to reach out to the folks in your network and try and encourage them to reach out to their representatives, because they don't care about, there's no point in writing to somebody in another district. They don't care about you. They only care about the people in their own districts, and sometimes not even them. And encourage everybody in your network to make a plan to vote. They say this is very effective, not just to sort of have vague aspirations, but to actually make a plan of how you're going to go about doing it. And if you or people you know are voting by mail, vote early, mail your ballot, and encourage your friends to mail their ballots in early enough that it will arrive by Election Day. There are a lot of states that give you a grace period that as long as you have it postmarked by Election Day, it should count. That's the way it should work. But I'm nervous, so I would encourage everybody to get their votes in early so that if there is a controversy over whether votes that arrive after Election Day should be counted, your vote won't be, or your friends' votes won't be caught up in that. And, consider volunteering to be an election worker. And if you have the ability to travel, consider reaching out to League chapters in other states around election time to see whether they need more staff. You probably can't actually staff the polls outside of your own state and jurisdiction, but there are other things that, there's other labor that needs to be done. In particular, you might consider reaching out to some of the groups that are going to be doing election protection work, because for that you don't even need to leave home. There's a lot of phone work. There are going to be a lot of questions on Election Day and around the election from people who are running into opposition and want to know what their rights are. And you can be, even if you're not a lawyer, you can be trained to answer the phones and help out. And we're going to need a lot of people operating those fine phone lines as we get closer to the next election. Obviously, make sure that you are well informed with information from reputable sources and be a truth teller. I don't really want to encourage anybody to spend a lot of time on social media these days, particularly not since content moderation seems to have gone out the window on most of these platforms. But to the extent that you are there, if you and in your interpersonal dealings, I don't think it's helpful to just shut out everybody that disagrees with us. We have to learn how to engage productively and calmly with people who have different views. And, there's you don't want to feed the trolls, but if you feel inclined to try and spread some truth, there's a technique called a truth sandwich. Because you don't want to magnify the conspiracies that are going on out there. So you start with the truth, and then you respond to the conspiracies, and then you end with the truth. And that appears to be a more effective way of trying to engage with people. And, listen, be open. Listen to what people have to say and where they're coming from. If you're a Fed and there's inaccurate information being conveyed about your agency, stand up for truth and try and share what you know. And hang in there, because we're going to need to rebuild. There's going to be a big rebuilding project in our future, and your expertise and ideas are needed for that project. And if you have ideas about how to improve your agency, work with the League to find out who's developing plans. Believe me, there are people who are working on this now who are trying to come up with ideas. We're not just going to try and, we can't go back. We can't just flip a switch and say, okay, we're going to return to the way everything worked before. We have to come up with new ideas to respond to the new environment, to create a leaner, more responsive government that people feel works for them. Because I think that's what turns people off. That's what makes people not vote. That's what makes people say, we were just talking at my table about how frustrating it is when people say, oh, all the parties are the same, all the politicians are the same. They're not. They're not. People have very different views out there, and there are views that I believe are better for democracy than other views. There are bills that are out there already, like the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the Protecting Our Democracy Act, that will help, and there are people who are working on developing new legislation to meet the moment. After Watergate, we had to have a lot of new legislation to try and build up our resources to prevent what happened 50 years ago. Now we've got new problems and new challenges, and we need new legislation and new ideas to confront that. I look back to 2020 as a source of inspiration. I remember how I felt in the spring of 2020, alone, not alone because I had my husband, but, relatively alone in my house, staring at the computer screen too long like all of us, afraid to interact in person with other human beings because of the pandemic. And I thought, how the hell are we going to run an election in this? People will be afraid to turn out. People will be afraid to be in a voting line. And what happened instead was that people across the nation were so creative and so energized and came up with so many great ways to make voting easier and more accessible, and basketball teams donating their arenas so that people could be in a space that was big and airy. People across the country trying to come up with new ways of doing this, and we ended up with an election where the turnout rate was the highest in 100 years. It was unbelievable. And, from a time where I personally was so concerned, how are we going to run this election? Will it be credible? Because will there be enough people voting to make it credible? We ended up with a hugely successful election where very many people turned out and voted. So we have shown before that in tough times, even in life-threatening times, people can figure out ways to make our democracy stronger and more vibrant, and we can do it again. People talk a lot, I hear a lot of talk about pendulums. It's like, the pendulum swings back and forth, so, and people may look at this last election as evidence of that. The election last time went in one direction, and now the election is going in the other direction. Well, a pendulum is just a weight on the end of a string, and it can go in any direction. It's not limited to just going back and forth. And it could just be standing still. There's no requirement that it actually move. The way that pendulums move is when somebody sets it in motion. And we need to make sure that we are working together to push that pendulum in the right direction. We need to work together to push that pendulum towards an America with free, fair, accessible, safe, and secure elections. We need to push that pendulum towards an America that respects due process and the rule of law. We need to push that pendulum towards an America where people are unafraid to express their views, even if, particularly if, they disagree with the party in power. We need to push that pendulum towards an America that cares for all of its citizens and ensures they can afford food, housing, and health care. We need to push that pendulum towards an America that treats every human being, whether they are citizens or not, with dignity and respect. We need to push that pendulum towards an America where public service is once again a public trust and government officials act in the public interest, not self-interest. Public service is a public trust, not a means for pursuing personal enrichment or personal vendettas. We can build that America if we work together, if we build alliances, if we stay focused. I want to work with you on that, and I know you are all here for that fight. So thank you for that. Thank you very much. You're very kind. How do you want to handle questions?
Well, let's see. We have our roaming microphone here, and I'm going to first check to see. There's a question already. Yay! We're going to call on Charlotte. Just wait, Charlotte, until the microphone gets to you.
Hello. How are you? Yes. Excuse me. You're with End Citizens United. Do you have a plan to do that?
I'm also, I should say, this was after I submitted my bio to the group, but I'm also on the National Governing Board of Common Cause, another good partner organization that works with the League. Yeah, well, ending Citizens United is a bit of a challenge, isn't it? I like the goal, and I like the organization. I wish I had a clear program for how we're going to do that. I think that Citizens United, such a bad decision. There's so many bad decisions, unfortunately, from the Supreme Court. But, you know, that was, yeah, I mean, the influence of billionaires in our government is, again, in this administration, has really gone to new levels. You know, the role that Elon Musk played in the last election. And I have to say that not only are there bad court decisions, but there were bad decisions at the FEC. I dissented from most of them, but there were bad decisions at the FEC. You know, it's interesting because the whole premise of Citizens United was that, well, one of the premises was that, A, the spending was going to be independent, which it clearly isn't, and it was all going to be disclosed. $2 billion in dark money from the last election. So that has not panned out. And Justice Kennedy very confidently wrote that nobody's going to lose faith in our democracy because of this money that's being spent. Well, there was just a poll done by, I forget whether it was Pew or Issue 1, that asked that specific question, whether all the money that's being spent through these super PACs causes people to lose faith in their democracy. And it was like, 3/4 of the respondents, Democrats, Independents, Republicans, you name it, everybody, you know, you got the highest percentage from Democrats, also from, you know, a little bit lower from Independents, a little bit lower from Republicans, but all of them a strong majority who said, yes, it causes us to lose faith. I think we can we can hope that we could build a factual record that might someday persuade the Supreme Court to reconsider that. We can work towards a constitutional amendment short of that, because, this Supreme Court seems pretty dug in on their money is speech philosophy. It's part, and I see it as part of, Citizens United is also of a piece with a lot of attacks on the administrative state, with a lot of, there are wealthy interests out there that don't want to be regulated. What does the administrative state do? And I will acknowledge that the administrative state in some places may have gotten bloated and perhaps could be more effective and more efficient in a variety of ways. But for the most part, the administrative state is out there representing the citizens and trying to make sure that they are not rolled over by big business, by polluters, by predatory banks, by a lot of interests out there that really would rather not be bothered with all that, as they just sort of plow ahead trying to make even more billions of dollars. So again, I think this is going to require a lot of concerted effort, and it's very unpopular. Citizens hate it, and we need to convey that consistently to our elected representatives. And as I said, we can work towards a constitutional amendment, which might be the only thing that could get past this Supreme Court. But I'm not going to pretend that this is going to be an easy fight, because in order to get a constitutional amendment, you have to get it through Congress too. Not just the states, but through Congress.
Thank you, Ellen, so much for my question for you. And I think I have stayed up many a night wondering this. Institutions and processes are only as good as the value and support for them. So I am asking, are we doing enough on civics, not just for young people, but for those who call themselves adults, both inside and outside the classroom? Because democratic culture is also what happens outside of the electoral process.
No, obviously. We don't, we were talking about this at my table earlier. We do not do a good job of civics education in our schools. And it's not just a school-related problem, because, as you say, there's a lot of adults that don't know their, when they do polls about, what are the three branches of government and who's the Chief Justice of the United States, and, the numbers of people who can't answer basic civics questions, the kind of questions that we demand of immigrants if they want to become citizens, right? Maybe we ought to make everybody take the same kind of citizen test that we make new citizens take. And we need to move these courses into senior centers and community centers. A few years ago, I convened a forum on disinformation at the FEC. It was a really interesting day. That it's all still online on the FEC website. And one of the points that was made there was that a lot of the people who spread disinformation online are older folks who are not very sophisticated about what they're seeing. And of course, there are people who are trying to mislead you, right? There are websites that look like they're legitimate journalism, but they're not. It all looks legit on the internet, right? They use the same fonts and they dress it up. So we need to do, you're right, we need to do a much better job of training people to be sophisticated about what they are seeing and what they are sharing.
Hi, I'm Diana Deem, and I just want to add, I want to refer to something that you've talked about a couple of different points during your speech, that we can't go back. Is it? Oh, is that better? You said we can't go back. And clearly we can't. We lost Democrats in the last election because they didn't see where government was working for them, and others, obviously. How do we do that? How do we not go back? Are you aware of any legislative or even broader proposals that we, as a community, can wrap ourselves around and start advocating for, that can make these broad changes, whether they're constitutional changes or just regular statutes or community norms, you name it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mentioned 3 different bills that are in Congress that, and I could probably run off a whole list more of them. But I think that what is actually more important, because a lot of these bills were already in the can before. They were already seen as needs before, and now we are seeing a lot of new challenges. And yes, there are groups that are working on this, and I don't know whether the League in particular is working with some of those groups who are trying to do that thinking, but we plainly need everybody's good thoughts on that, on how we can build a better democracy, a more responsive democracy, a leaner democracy, how we can address some of the ethical issues that have arisen in the last 9 months, 10 months. I feel like I'm aging every day. Well, I guess we're all aging every day, but I feel like we're on accelerated time. We're going to need to come up with new ideas, because there have been new challenges, things that I never, who the hell would have ever anticipated that the President of the United States would hire a construction company to show up in the middle of the night and literally, take a wrecking ball to the White House? It is not his house. It doesn't belong to him. So, we have to come up with strategies for dealing with stuff like that. And by the way, I heard it was a Maryland construction company that did that. What were they thinking?
Hi, I'm Julie Yang. Currently, I serve on the school board, and I'm also a candidate for County Council District 1. Now, my question is about campaign financing. Montgomery County does public financing.
Well done.
Okay, Montgomery County does public financing. How does this fit into a national conversation about campaign reforms? What can we do? Thank you.
That is something that is being addressed on a lot of state and local levels. New York City has a great public financing system. Montgomery County does. There are other locations that are working on that. Seattle has an innovative program called Democracy Vouchers. There are different ways that we can do this. You have to overcome a certain amount of resistance from folks who say, why are we spending our tax dollars on running all these campaign ads that we hate anyway? Can't they look at how much money they're raising privately? Why do they need taxpayer money? But that money, there's different kinds of campaign money. There's a lot of small donations, and the internet has really empowered those kinds of donations. And there's a downside even to small donations. Some political scientists have theorized that they also drive extremism, that they support more extreme candidates. But they are not corrupting. People who are sending in $25 on the internet, nobody's going to get corrupted by that. And so the premise of a lot of public financing now is to magnify the impact of those small donations, to have 6-to-1 matches or 8-to-1 matches. People have tried different theories on that. The Democracy Voucher program in Seattle is based on the idea that everybody gets $4 $50, $25. Yeah, and it encourages the candidates to reach out to communities where they might not otherwise have gone, because everybody gets those vouchers. So, if there are communities where well, this isn't a high turnout area, and this isn't an area where there's a lot of rich people who can give me donations, politicians might be inclined to say, well, I don't even need to talk to those people. Well, now every single citizen in Seattle has something of value to those politicians that will hopefully encourage them. And I think the program is working pretty well.
More people are running, people without means.
Yeah.
Candidates.
Yeah, so there are innovative ideas that are happening at the state and local level to try to counteract the influence of big money. But we have to go back not only to Citizens United but to Buckley. Our Supreme Court has given us, we're stuck with the world that they have given us, and it is not the only world that we could be living in. In Canada, where they come from, kind of a similar legal common law background. Also, once part of the British Empire. They have an entirely different, their Supreme Court came to an entirely opposite conclusion. I've always found this fascinating, that, here we have two neighboring countries that have a lot in common in their histories and in their laws. And when the United States Supreme Court was faced with the question of, can you limit the amount of money that is spent in elections, they said, no, you're limiting speech. The best way to get the most robust debate is to have everybody be able to spend as much as they want to spend. And that's how we'll get this robust, wide-open debate that we want to have on the issues. And in Canada, when they were faced with the very same question, they said, well, if you don't have any limits, then one side could completely outspend the other side and drown out their voices so that the public does not get an equal opportunity to hear from both sides of the argument. And so they upheld spending limits. That was part of one of the original Watergate reforms, was the Federal Election Campaign Act, and which had both contribution limits and spending limits. And the court said, okay, you can have contribution limits, but you can't have spending limits. And that has driven where we are, for the last 50 years. But it's not, it's important to remember, it's not the only way that we could be. And again, it would be a very heavy lift to persuade the Supreme Court that we need to go in a different direction on campaign finance. But, we should have a broader view, and we should not assume that the way things are is the only way that they could be.
My name is Dinah Stevens. I was on the Common Cause National Governing Board before there was campaign finance reform back in the 70s. So I've been through this cycle. But I have a different kind of question for you. There are people who are looking at enlarging Congress to like 539 members and reforming the Supreme Court, not just as a way of retribution for the Trump nominees, but because there are really legitimate concerns. Are you involved in that at all, and do you have any thoughts on how either one of those might be done?
I'm not involved. You could change the number of people on the Supreme Court. That's just a question of statute. It's been avoiding that would be helpful. Well, yes, you're right. The threat is that whenever one side has all three, has the presidency in the House and the Senate, they're going to, increase the court by a few more seats in order to get their own majority. Another way of dealing with what is happening on the Supreme Court is term limits for Supreme Court justices, which is now. They have life tenure, so I've seen proposals where they would rotate off of the Supreme Court and then would serve on circuit courts or in some other judicial capacity, because it's hard, without again changing the Constitution, to take away their life tenure. But it's. I think that's a really interesting idea. And when you see some people on the court for, when you see these games being played to put young people on the court so that they will be there for 40, 50 years, entrenching certain views, then it's, do we even I'm not smart enough to predict what's going to happen in 50 years or in 40 years, or who would be the right person to be making those kinds of important decisions for the country, 40, 50 years into the future. So, the number that I've seen floated is 18 years as an appropriate term for the Supreme Court. I think it's a really interesting idea. What was the other?
Enlarging Congress.
Oh, enlarging Congress. I think that's also an interesting idea. I mean, it's been done before. They might need to do some building to, and enlarge the House of Representatives. But apparently we can do that. Some of these congressional districts are, I think, close to 1 million people now. How do you represent that many people? And how do you fairly represent the diversity of viewpoints that you get from that many people? So again, I think we ought to be encouraging a lot of outside-the-box creative thinking about how we can make democracy better. And I'm all for let's throw all the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks.
Hello, thank you for coming to us today. I appreciate your views. Yes, I wonder if you could tell us about enlarged rights of prisoners or former felons. There's been I'm interested in having voting rights for prisoners, former felons. Is there anything in the works for them?
I think, again, that's something that is people are working on in different localities, and it's something that has to be, again, there are no fights that are ever over. They passed this great referendum in Florida, and then the legislature worked to undo it, to make it, to take those rights away from people that overwhelming numbers of Floridians supported, giving voting rights back to returning citizens who had, paid their debt to society. And then the state legislator said, well, not until they've paid all of the fees that are associated with their crimes, and oh, by the way, we can't even tell you what that number would be. But if they haven't paid it back and then they try and vote, they could go back to jail. I mean, the way the state legislature there tried to undermine what the voters had just accomplished was just mind-boggling. So this is an effort that is going on, as I said, in different states and localities, and I agree with you. I think it's a good cause. If we want to incorporate people back into our society, make them feel like they have a stake in this society and they shouldn't just go back to a life of crime, giving them voting rights, that would be a good thing to do, I would think. Oh God, I'm blanking on his name. It's Desmond something or other. The guy in Florida who started that movement is so impressive, and I think that could happen in other places as well. And there is legislation in other places to do that. The issue that of having incarcerated people actually voting, that is something that I don't think there's a lot of in this country, but there are other countries where they allow that. In fact, I have been as an election observer to some countries where I actually went into a jail in order to watch how they did the voting in jail. So I don't think any of those things should be necessarily off the table.
Hi there. Excellent presentation. My name is Crystal. I'm currently a furloughed employee at the National Institute of Standards and Technology out in Gaithersburg. And
well, why would we want to have standards and technology, right?
NIST, locals. So I just had some questions, or I wanted your opinion on how you feel about the voting machines. There are, I guess, growing conspiracies about the influence of, our tech oligarchs and what type of backdoors may be built into some of those systems that could, maybe alter votes potentially. And I think more and more people are feeling less confident in the results because they think there was some interference. And just wondering, if these elections are being managed at the state level, like what can we do at a federal level to give people some confidence that these systems, these technology systems are not being interfered by all of the people who were at the inauguration.
Yeah, yes, it's a hypothetical. I used to worry about foreign interference. Well, I still worry about foreign interference, but yeah, sometimes the phone calls coming from inside the house, and that's even scarier. As you probably know better than I do, there are standards that the EAC, the other election commission, which still has a quorum, is involved with promoting. The president is trying to tell them what to do, and I think that is a story that is still unfolding and needs to be monitored. And as you know, NIST also has been involved in setting some of those standards. It is routine, as I'm sure you know, that these machines are not hooked up to the internet to prevent hacking. But this, unfortunately, the notion that the tech bros might be, coding something nefarious in there, it sounds too believable, and so that's how the conspiracy theory gets going. I'm not aware of any evidence that that is actually happening. I just haven't heard anything that would substantiate that. And I think, as with a lot of conspiracy theories, we just have to keep pushing back and asking for actual evidence and not just theories. But, it's once people start going down a rabbit hole, it's kind of hard to open them back up.
Sorry.
But let me just say one more thing, is that I think most modern voting machines do have a voter-verified paper trail. There was a time when, people were very taken with these, touch screens, which, as you know, we tried in Montgomery County. We no longer have them in Montgomery County because you need to have a paper trail so that you can go back and document what the actual votes were.
All our stuff is on paper.
Yeah.
Hi.
Sorry.
Again, thank you for speaking today. In today's world where things have become a little violent, and there is a fair amount of concern about what the safety level is in going in to physically vote. And I think you had mentioned, the question of, you shouldn't have maybe I misremember you, but of not having someone there who's a soldier or whatever.
Yeah, the military's not allowed in polling stations.
At the site. But on the other hand, there might be people who feel more comfortable being able to vote, not worrying about getting shot at, because they worry about, not worrying about getting shot at or something like that. How do you feel about how that might be able to be managed?
Well, I don't think we ought to have the military in polling stations. That would be illegal. And if there is a need for local police to intervene in a dangerous situation, they are available. I'm not aware of any situations in the United States where the local police presence was not sufficient to handle whatever was going on. Most polling stations are peaceful. I do worry about the possibility of disinformation spreading where one could envision, for example, an AI video that purports to show rioting at the polling station, and then, local citizens are afraid to go and vote. And then you find out after the election, oh, that was just an AI-generated video. There was no riot at the polling station. So I think we, if you're worried about physical violence at the polling station, most jurisdictions have other options. You can vote by mail in most jurisdictions. Some of them have more restrictions than others, but certainly it's very accessible here in Maryland. There's early voting where things are less crowded, if that makes you feel more comfortable. But I do not think, I have been to other countries. Like I said, I've done election observations. I've been to other countries where the military is present in the polling station, and that's what they told me too. It's like, oh, our citizens feel more secure this way, and I thought, do they really? When the governing authority, when the military that is responsive to the party in power is there with machine guns at the polling station, does that really make you feel better about voting and more secure about voting? It wouldn't make me feel better, and certainly given the way the military has been deployed in various cities and the kind of scenes that we've seen from ICE agents, I don't think we want to encourage more of a military presence in our polling stations. I would be opposed to that personally.
Hello, this is back to the civics education question. I'm Carla Silvestre. I'm also a candidate for county council on the school board, and I work at our community college, Montgomery College. So education, Montgomery County is a third foreign-born, so people are coming from all over the world with different universes in terms of what democracy or authoritarian systems look like. So obviously education must play a big role in our own community here. Who's doing it well? Who's doing it well nationally or internationally that we might want to replicate, just because it's so important, so that we can continue this tradition of people really caring and standing up for democracy in this country.
The Australians seem to do a good job of civics education, and they've got mandatory voting and a very high voter turnout rate. They really do consider it a part of being a good citizen is to vote. I'm sure there are jurisdictions in this country that are doing it well. I'm just not an expert on how civics education is being handled across the nation. So I'm not really in a position to point you to go there. It's hard for me to imagine that passing here, but I think it's a fun idea. Yeah, we got these two people on opposite ends.
Chris Hager, a couple of comments, and then I have a question. My comments are that, first of all, I think it's a fraud to call yourself a citizen and not register and not vote. My own personal feeling. Secondly, Maryland does have legal voting for felons who've completed their sentences. In fact, Montgomery County has gone to the jail and registered people to vote. My question regards groups like CREW, the Citizen Representative Ethics Group, right, and Jamie Raskin's proposed ethics legislation, which he hopes we have a new Congress can get through, about not just looking at the president's emoluments, but also looking at the ethics in the Supreme Court. What do you think, especially about ethics in the Supreme Court?
I think it could be better. Well, I think it's a problem when anybody holds themselves above the law. It's bad when the president feels like he has no restraints. It's bad when the Supreme Court feels like they have no restraints. I just refuse to believe that there's no way to address that. I think there've been some very, Jamie Raskin has got a bunch of legislation, so I'm not sure what the details are of the specific proposal that you're talking about, but I have seen proposals to, put together a panel of retired judges or circuit court judges who could serve as ethics at least advisors to the Supreme Court. It just, when it's anytime, you see these stories about the luxurious travel that some of these high public officials have engaged in at private expense. And, I used to be an ethics person at the House of Representatives, and Dave was over at the Senate. So I remember getting lots and lots of questions from people who would say, well, this guy wants to give me this really valuable thing, and, we're friends. It's all based on personal friendship. And, a lot of those folks found out when they were no longer in office that those people were not such close friends as they thought. And, of course, one of my first questions when they would say, well, this is just based on friendship. It's like, well, how long have you known them? Well, I met them after I got elected to Congress. And do you give them gifts? Is it a reciprocal relationship? And the answer to that was almost always no. Not that members of Congress can't have friends and Supreme Court justices, but, when you make wealthy friends after you assume a position of great power and influence, and they want to give you all sorts of fancy presents, I think, you have to be deluding yourself to think that this is totally unrelated to your job. Do you want to do it, or me say something?
Well, thank you again. Thank you again to our speaker.